Rupert Read, hi.
Hey Vlad.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing just fine, thank you. I'm very excited about my new book, which you've kindly got on the screen there, and yeah, I'm busy as ever.
So the book, it sums up your experience over the last months of partaking in the Extinction Rebellion
Yeah,
journey. And you've had two processes with this journey. One's actually doing it, and the other is looking at it from the side and looking at what it means, looking what's working, looking at what's not working. So I want to ask you, almost in a personal way, does climate action, does climate protest work?
Hmm. Well, I think the answer to that is obviously to some extent we don't know yet, because what we really need is
I love that.
protest, is rebellion at a far greater scale than we've had so far. I think the signs are kind of good, in the sense that the first Extinction Rebellion in April 2019, as I describe in the book, it's absolutely clear that that had a massive impact on public opinion and political opinion, government opinion, and that it really moved the dial in that way. That's very clear in the opinion polls. But you've asked me to answer the question on a personal level. And on a personal level, I will say that I'm nervous that the chances of it working enough are not as great as they should be, because we're so late in the day, because it's hard to carry everybody with you, and most importantly, to go back to the first point I made, because we just need a far greater scale.
Can we translate this sort of observation into lessons? Because I think that if we're going to be pessimistic about particular protest movements or particular types of protest or particular types of climate action, given the scale of climate change as a challenge to us, I am confident to bet that climate action isn't going away. In fact,
Mm.
that it's got a
Yeah,
brighter future than it's had before, for
yeah,
obvious reasons. So it's really a conversation about what shape that takes and
yeah,
how you frame it and how you keep better understanding what you're up to.
yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Look, my book tells, in a way, an incredibly exciting story, and in a way, quite a sad story. The way it's a sad story is that as the book goes on, I become less optimistic that there's a chance of meeting anything like the original goals or demands that XR had. Um, that's hardly a big surprise, because those goals were eye-watering, and the situation is so incredibly challenging, that the issue of climate is so difficult because of the way it's on such a long time scale and the way it threatens fundamental economic interests of some very powerful people, etc. But all the same, it's sad that the story hasn't been yet more successful so far. But tragically, the climate and ecological emergency is such that, as you say, this is only going to carry on and find new expressions and new stronger waves in the years to come, as the climate and ecology situation worsens, because that's what is bound to happen. So
What might
yeah.
be the shape of the sort of thing you were doing, sort of thing
Mm.
you are doing with Extinction Rebellion in 10 years' time? Because
Okay.
presumably the umbrella of people who are conscious about the climate crisis will expand, and that
Yeah.
will have very interesting consequences for the
Yeah.
sort of thing you've been doing.
Absolutely. 10 years is a long time. I'd rather go to 3, 4, 5 years, if I may. And what I'd say is that I think that one thing I'd be willing to predict, although this is a bit of a mug's game, is that there will be a much greater emphasis on what I call, as I discussed in the book, transformative adaptation. And so that's two words: transformative, which is about changing our society in the ways it needs to be changed in anyway, and adaptation. And what we mean by adaptation is not just trying to prevent the catastrophe, because it's too late to prevent disasters. They are here and worse ones will already be coming. But to adapt to what's here and what's coming as best we can in a way that will mitigate those disasters and hopefully manage to prevent catastrophe. Transformative adaptation, I think, is going to be a big wave of the way that climate protest and eco-action moves in the coming years. And what it will boil down to is nonviolent direct action and other related methods of protest and action in the service of the kind of thing that the transition towns movements and permaculturalists and so on have been calling for some time. So in other words, it will probably, a lot of it will take place on a more regional or indeed local community scale. And it will be about creating and defending the kind of changes that we need to cope with what is here and what is coming, which crucially means, for example, local food resilience.
And you think that the transformative adaptation argument is easier or harder to sell than other arguments? To sell on a doorstep.
Yeah.
So when you're telling somebody on the doorstep who agrees that climate change is a very big problem, and then says, well, all right, what can we do to stop it? And then there is Rupert telling me about this idea of adapting to it, not just preventing it. Yeah. What does it mean for me?
Yeah, good. So there's a way in which it's easier and a way in which it's harder. The way in which it's harder is that you have to get to the point of people being willing to accept that we're not going to have a wonderful solution to everything. We're not going to be able to save this civilization in the form that it currently exists, that things are going to carry on deteriorating for quite a while. This is fact, this is reality. But actually psychologically accepting it, most people are nowhere near that point yet. But the way in which it's easier is it's easier to envisage, and it's easier to do, and it's easier to get returns and results. Prevention and mitigation, in the technical sense of that term, mitigation, is very challenging because we've got, of course, the vast time and vast space parameters of the problem to deal with, and any change that anyone makes through climate action can seem almost inconsequential on that global and longue durée kind of scale. But with adaptation, especially with something positive like transformative adaptation, people will be able to actually see the difference that they're making and feel it, and they will know what it means in their lives to have, for example, a more reliable sense of where their food is coming from, whether that comes from pop-up allotments or taking back into cultivation land that some farmer is misusing or what have you. So in that sense, it's easier, and that I think is something really positive. That is part of the reason why I think that transformative adaptation will happen.
So when you talk about this civilization not being able to persist in its current form, what am I meant to visualize when you say that? Am I meant to visualize a dramatic contraction of the economy, a series of changes about where we live and how we live, but broadly a similar way of organizing the economy, broadly a similar way of running our politics? Or are you envisaging something more catastrophic, like things really not being able to go on, even in a deflated version of what we've got?
Yeah.
What am I meant to see when you say that?
Yeah, so basically, and it's a huge question, right? And it would take us forever to provide a full answer to it. But in very simple terms, there's two alternatives, right? Either this civilization will come to an end by way of some kind of collapse event, which may be slow or may be fast. Or this civilization will come to an end by way of something like what I'm calling transformative adaptation. It will, to some extent, choose to transform itself in the ways that it needs to. And what that will mean is that food supplies and other things will be occurring to a large extent on a more local basis. There will need to be some kind of relocalization also of power. You could think about this through the prism of local citizens' assemblies. The detail we just don't know, and it depends upon so many parameters. But this civilization no longer taking its current form, the positive way in which that could happen is through something like transformative adaptation being writ large across our society, or indeed across much of the world.
Now, I know that you don't necessarily think that what you would call societal collapse is likely, but you think it doesn't matter what one thinks about that, because a precautionary approach, which you're a very big admirer of, would say, look, we've got to be aware that this is a possibility. So I think I understand where you stand on that intellectually. How personally concerned are you about societal collapse?
I guess now I do think about it pretty much every day, and sometimes it penetrates my dreams as well. That doesn't necessarily mean I think it's likely to happen soon, because if it happens late this century or even sometime next century, it would still be catastrophic when it happens. Do I think it's likely? Yes, I do think it is likely sooner or later. It's incredibly hard to make this assessment, but we have, I believe, tragically increasing reason to believe over recent years, from climate, from ecology, from social studies, from looking at history, from philosophy, we have increasing reason to believe, I think, that it is unlikely that we're going to be able to change course in time. And that, as I say, is a judgment which one may be able to make now, even if one thinks it isn't necessarily likely that a collapse will happen soon or quickly, because the time lags here are enormous, and the sort of inertial factors in our societies in terms of things such as the infrastructure that we have are enormous. So it's something that, that personally does preoccupy me quite a bit now. As you say, I don't think it's certain. I'm not even certain that it's likely. But my personal feeling is that at some point it is likely, that it's going to be hard to stop. That, of course, is a very strong reason for engaging in transformative adaptation and other forms of preparedness for what could be coming, because transformative adaptation will work if it transforms our society. But it will also work as a kind of preparation for potential collapse. It will work in that sense as what people call deep adaptation.
So you've spent quite a few years talking about how we think about future generations. So I want you to tell people a little bit about your view on this, about how you invite people to think about the future generations, which are the people that haven't yet been born and the people that we haven't yet met. This has been something that's been a big part of your life, I know, for many years now, this conversation.
Yeah.
What do you think about, the way we should think about this issue?
So this is actually going to be the topic of my next book, which will be coming out around Christmas time later this year. But as you say, it's something I've been thinking about a lot for years. It ties in, of course, to what I said a couple of minutes ago about the sense in which even if collapse comes long after we are dead, it's still something we should be profoundly concerned about. Because what are we as human beings if we are not profoundly concerned with the fate of our children and of their children and of their children? That's who we are as mammals, and in particular as self-aware, self-conscious mammals, who historically at least have often been quite good at thinking in the truly long term about the communities that we're a part of, and that always outlast us, or at least always should outlast us. And it's in that kind of iteration of our children and their children and their children that perhaps the most important element of my thinking about the philosophy of future generations is concerned. Because my strong belief is that if people come to see the way in which they can't really be caring for their children unless they're simultaneously creating or helping to create or helping to facilitate a world in which their children will be able to take care of their children, and so on without end, that unless that is the case, well, then we're not really taking care of our children, and we're not really actually loving them in anything like the full meaning of that word. So my belief is that coming to understand the way that our love for our children is transitive or iterates down the generations could precipitate a real revolution in our consciousness and in our politics and in everything. And that's really what my next book is about. I'm pretty excited about it because part of the hope there is that this is a consideration which, if someone can come to understand it, and actually it's quite simple really, just the idea that, look, you care for your children, you've got to make it possible for them to care for their children, and so on. If this idea were to take hold, it could be powerful way beyond the ordinary constituency, if you will, of climate concern or environmental activism. Basically, it's a consideration that applies to everybody who is or could be a parent, or everybody who cares about their nephews, nieces, anything like that. In other words, it applies to pretty much every single human being in the whole world.
I wanted to put your views front and center, but I want to quickly express a view of my own that I think you also agree with. And that's that I often feel when we talk about climate messaging that I don't know whether something works or not. And what's remarkable is how few people regularly say that. One of the issues, of course, is that there's a kind of risk of a conservative paranoia, which says that if a climate protest movement has some faults in it, it can't on balance be a good thing. And then there is sometimes a sort of radical paranoia on the other side, which says, well, look, nothing our government can do could ever be good because the system is part of the problem. And so what's very important is that we don't think of this in a completely unitary way. We don't think of there being the right message for everyone. I read somebody on Twitter the other day saying that, you know, overly dramatic arguments persuade unevenly and therefore they're bad. But the thought I have about all of this, and I think you really agree with this, is that different people will be persuaded by different arguments made by different people in different ways. You know, just because the bread you have baked isn't the right bread for me to eat doesn't mean a lot of people won't eat it. So it's very often both and not either or. And I think that could liberate us out. Understanding that more could liberate us out into broadening our table of politics at which we're comfortable to sit and engage with others.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that scientists should speak, for example, is not the same as the way in which a philosopher invoking the precautionary principle should speak. And that's different again from the way that a campaigner might speak. And then, as you say, that will depend in more fine-grained ways too on the particular audience. If a campaigner is speaking to fellow campaigners, they'll naturally talk in a different way from if they're speaking to the general public. So yeah, it's a complete illusion to think that there is one correct way of talking about the climate or about the ecological emergency. We ought not necessarily to let 100 flowers bloom here, but we ought to let at least 20 or 30 or 40 bloom. And if we have that kind of somewhat pluralist attitude to discourse in this area, we have more chance of success in actually moving the totality of a society, which is made up of very different people with very different roles, very different constituencies. Yeah.
Rupert, it's been lovely to have you on. You've been on my show where we talk about how to make sense of this century that we live in. And this week, I'm talking all week about the climate crisis. And it was lovely to have the first exchange of the week with you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Take care.
Cheers.